You killed my dog because I'm black, and you thought no one would care. That was the moment the truth broke the surface. No more silence, no more polite lies whispered over garden fences. It didn't start with screams or a police siren. It started with a poison treat tossed into a yard at dawn, and a Rottweiler named Ranger collapsing on the sidewalk, gasping for breath while the woman who smiled at church on Sundays watched from behind her curtains. This wasn't about a leash. It wasn't about property lines. It was about a man, a black man, walking his dog through a neighborhood that decided his presence was a problem. They didn't know who he was. They just knew he didn't fit. And when his composure didn't crack, when he didn't shout, didn't break, they pushed harder. They didn't see a retired criminal investigator. They saw a threat in a tracksuit. But what happens when the man they tried to erase turns out to be the storm they never saw coming? If that first sentence hit you, stick around, because this story only gets deeper, darker, and more real. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what moment shook you the most? And don't forget to like and subscribe. This is only the beginning. The moving truck pulled away with a groan, its tires crunching against the perfect pavement of Willowgate Lane, leaving behind a home that now bore new life. The front yard still smelled faintly of fresh mulch, flower beds neatly outlined with dark brown bark, and the American flag on the porch hung still in the summer heat. Elijah Grant stood on the porch, his broad shoulders slightly tense, his gaze sweeping the street like a man reading a room he had just entered. Beside him, Ranger sat, a large Belgian Malinois with a calm, watchful presence, his tongue lolling slightly from the side of his mouth as he panted. Retired now, but still alert, still ready. This was supposed to be a new beginning. After 18 years with the homicide unit, Elijah had decided it was time for quiet. No more crime scenes, no more late-night stakeouts, no more body bags. Willowgate was the promise of peace, a cul-de-sac community lined with symmetrical homes, spotless sidewalks, and neighbors who waved with just enough warmth to seem sincere. He'd chosen this place for Ranger as much as for himself, a final chapter they could write in silence. The first neighbor appeared within the hour. An older man in a golf polo and pressed khakis crossed the street with a practiced smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, extending a firm hand. "Roger Kramer, HOA president." Elijah shook it, offering a polite nod. "Elijah Grant, retired detective. This is Ranger." Roger bent to pat the dog, but hesitated halfway, eyes flicking to the sharp lines of Ranger's muzzle. "Ah, big fella," he muttered, straightening. "He trained." Elijah's smile thinned just slightly. "He's smarter than half the people I've met in my life. He won't bother anyone unless they give him a reason." Roger chuckled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We like things peaceful around here. Rules posted online. Let me know if you have questions." By sundown, Elijah had counted 6 neighbors, each arriving with a dish or a pamphlet or a wary look. Smiles stretched wide, but eyes stayed narrow. Ranger, ever intuitive, stayed close to Elijah's heel each time the door opened. He wasn't growling, but he wasn't relaxed either. Across the street, Denise Halvorson stood behind her curtain, barely moving. Mid-60s, silver bob haircut, always in beige. She had lived in Willowgate since the development was first built and considered herself something of a keeper of the peace. She didn't wave, didn't approach. But when Elijah took Ranger for his first walk around the cul-de-sac just before nightfall, she watched. And when she saw him, tall, black, calm but confident, she lifted her phone. The group chat for Willowgate was deceptively friendly in name, neighbors and nurture. A thread started. "New neighbor across from me. Big dog. Anyone know who he is?" Then another message seconds later. "Looks like law enforcement maybe, but be alert." No one challenged her directly, but hearts began appearing under the message. Thumbs up. A few quiet comments. Saw him unloading. Kept to himself. Dog looks aggressive. Back at his house, Elijah sipped a glass of iced tea on the porch, his gaze drifting to the street where only crickets dared speak. He felt it, that buzz behind the silence. He'd been in too many interrogation rooms not to sense tension. Willowgate was too neat, too quiet. And in his experience, silence that perfect was always hiding something loud. Ranger lay beside him, eyes open, ears flicking at every sound. The dog didn't relax, not really. Elijah's phone buzzed. A message from his friend Maya, still on the force. "You sure about that neighborhood? That HOA's been in the news before." Low-key bias complaints. Elijah didn't reply right away. He stared at the message, then at Ranger. "What do you think, boy?" Ranger thumped his tail once. Elijah smirked. "Thought so." Inside, he began unpacking the office. Certificates, awards, a shadow box holding his badge, now retired, photos of him and Ranger from their service days. But when he tried to hang the plaque by the window, he stopped. The curtain across the street shifted. Denise again, watching, her silhouette blurred behind the lace, unmoving but present. Elijah sighed and let the plaque rest on the desk instead. Let them guess who he was. It wasn't about announcing himself. It was about observing. Denise uploaded the picture she had secretly taken, Elijah standing tall, Ranger at his side, to a private album on her phone titled Flagged. She zoomed in on Ranger's eyes, trying to decide if they looked dangerous. She didn't trust animals she couldn't intimidate. She didn't trust men she couldn't read. And she especially didn't trust men who looked like Elijah Grant and didn't smile unless they meant it. Night crept in slow, the porch light flickering on with a soft click. Elijah sat in a chair just inside the screen door, Ranger stretched beside him. He wasn't afraid, but the stillness here didn't fool him. Willowgate was the kind of place where people didn't raise their voices. They wrote anonymous letters, filed quiet complaints, whispered into homeowner group threads instead of speaking out loud. He'd seen it all before, in courtrooms, in suburbs, in precincts where racism wore a suit and tie and smiled during lunch breaks. The next morning in Willowgate bloomed with the same deceptive tranquility as always. Lawn sprinklers pulsed in perfect rhythm. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and fertilizer, and porch flags hung in their predetermined angles. But Elijah knew better than to be lulled. As he stepped onto his front porch, steaming mug of coffee in hand, Ranger padded beside him with ears perked. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but already the air buzzed, not with sound, but with tension. He glanced toward Denise's house. Curtain twitch. Again. Predictable. She never waved, just watched. Elijah looked away and descended the steps. That's when he saw it. A plain manila envelope resting quietly inside his mailbox. No name, no postage, no handwriting, just a printed label on the front. Guidelines for responsible pet ownership. He opened it right there, flipping through pages that detailed local leash laws, noise ordinances, and a flyer warning about aggressive breeds around children. There were no annotations, no notes, no signatures, but the implication screamed through every word. Elijah narrowed his eyes. The print was glossy, professional, laser quality. He'd seen it before. Denise had boasted to one of the other neighbors during his move-in week about her top-grade laser printer. Clean edges, no smudge, makes HOA notices look official. This wasn't a city-issued notice. It was a message, one dressed up as a friendly reminder, but delivered with the precision of passive aggression. And it was meant for him. He placed the envelope on the kitchen counter, then turned to check his security footage from the front porch cam. Timestamp, 4:47 a.m. Nothing conclusive, just shadows, a soft flash of movement, then the envelope appearing in frame like a magic trick. Someone knew his system's blind spots. That alone told him they weren't new to this game. He checked the side yard camera next, grainy footage of Ranger sniffing near the back fence. Elijah noticed something odd, a flicker of light, sharp and thin, across the lens. Not a bug, not a glitch. Laser interference. Someone had pointed a beam directly at the sensor, washing out the feed for nearly 90 seconds. He replayed it. Same time each morning for the last 3 days. The footage always cut clarity, just as Ranger did his business in the same far corner of the yard. Elijah's jaw tensed. Whoever was doing this wasn't just annoyed. They were observing, testing, planning. Later that afternoon, he walked Ranger past the community garden near the parkway. A woman pushing a stroller gave him a tight-lipped smile, pulling her toddler a little closer as they passed. Two teenage boys tossing a football paused mid-throw and watched Ranger like he might snap at any moment. Elijah kept walking, back straight, leash loose, gaze forward. Ranger didn't react to the stares, but Elijah saw everything. When he returned home, another envelope waited. This one slid halfway under his welcome mat. Same content, same formatting, new highlight. Some breeds have a history of unpredictable behavior. Beneath the line, a stock photo of a growling dog. Not Ranger's breed, but close enough to make the point. Elijah stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken hostility pressing down like humidity. He wasn't angry, not yet. Anger was an emotion. He operated best with evidence, pattern, motive, behavior. All three were starting to emerge. That evening, he ran a quiet test. He left Ranger outside at the usual time and monitored the side camera in real time from his phone. At precisely 5:03 a.m., the flicker returned. A pinpoint red that skimmed the edge of the lens, too faint to trigger alarms, but bright enough to distort the recording. A figure moved just outside frame. A quick blur. No defining features. But the motion confirmed what he suspected. Someone was targeting his dog's routine. He reviewed the mail drop timestamps again. Always pre-dawn. Always when the neighborhood was still. Always anonymous. Whoever was behind it had watched long enough to know his habits. When he left, when he returned, when Ranger was alone. And that meant their next move wouldn't be paper. Across the street, Denise trimmed her rose bushes with dainty precision, lips pursed in satisfaction. She glanced up once, locked eyes with Elijah, and offered a curt nod. He didn't return it. He only watched, his face unreadable, his mind already working through the next phase. The neighborhood might have preferred things quiet, but Elijah knew silence was just another way to scream. Ranger lying under the porch shade with his tongue out and ears twitching toward every breeze. The street was quiet as always, manicured into a dream of suburban civility. But today, Denise crossed that invisible threshold. She strolled toward his property line with an iced glass of something sweet in hand, her sun hat tilted just enough to throw a shadow across her carefully made-up face. "Afternoon, Mr. Grant," she called, voice syrupy with manufactured cheer. Elijah straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his forearm. "Afternoon." Denise didn't stop at the sidewalk like a courteous neighbor might. She stepped 2 paces in, close enough to make Ranger shift his weight, though he remained down. "Lovely dog," she said, nodding toward the Malinois, "but quite large for this kind of community, don't you think?" Her tone was light, but Elijah heard the calculation under it, the subtle friction buried beneath friendly phrasing. He gave a slight shrug. "He's retired. Smart, quiet, well-trained. Doesn't make trouble." Denise chuckled, swirling her drink. "Oh, I'm sure you believe that. But you know how some dogs just set people off, especially the little ones around here." She glanced toward the empty cul-de-sac behind them. No kids in sight, none ever seen. The last thing we want is someone getting scared or hurt. Elijah didn't blink. "You mean the kids that don't live here?" Denise froze for half a breath, then smiled again. "Just trying to keep the peace, Mr. Grant. That's all we want in Willowgate. A little order, a little predictability." Elijah nodded once, slow and measured. "I like predictability. Makes things easier to track." Denise's smile faltered for just a second before she excused herself and walked away, the clink of ice in her glass the only sound following her across the street. That night, Elijah double-checked every lock, reviewed the security footage twice, and updated his threat log. He didn't have proof, not yet, but he had pattern. People who say just keeping the peace rarely mean peace for everyone. The next morning, the first test came. Elijah let Ranger out into the yard as usual, standing by the porch with coffee in hand. The dog moved with purpose, sniffing the perimeter like he always did, but near the back fence, where shrubs marked the property line, Ranger suddenly paused. He sniffed something nestled in the grass, then leaned down as if to eat it. Elijah's voice snapped like a whip. "Leave it." Ranger froze instantly, trained instinct overriding curiosity. Elijah strode over and knelt beside him, brushing aside the grass to reveal a small biscuit-like treat, unmarked, but with an unusual smell, slightly sweet, slightly metallic. He lifted it with a gloved hand and dropped it into a Ziploc bag. Denise's house sat directly across from that stretch of the fence. And there she was, standing on her porch with a teacup in hand, watching. She didn't wave, just smiled, lifted the cup faintly in mock greeting, and turned to walk back inside. Elijah placed the bag in his freezer and noted the time. 6:42 a.m. He reviewed the footage from the side yard cam, but again, the same flicker of red light interrupted the view for 90 seconds. Laser again. He began to track the pattern in earnest now, building timelines, sketching behavior escalation charts like he used to for suspects. The treat hadn't been a mistake. It had been a test. One he had just barely interrupted. He emailed the image of the biscuit to Maya, attaching his notes with a subject line that read, "Passive-aggressive neighbor escalation. Possible target equals Ranger. Thoughts?" Maya replied within the hour, "That smell equals ethylene glycol? It's used in antifreeze. Keep freezing samples. This isn't paranoia anymore. This is prep work." That evening, Denise hosted a garden club mixer in her backyard. Elijah wasn't invited, but he heard the soft laughter, the clinking of glasses, the murmurs of neighbors gathered. Ranger lay beside his feet as he sat in the shadows of his screened porch, listening. When he glanced through the trees, he could make out the shape of her sun hat, the way her hand gestured animatedly toward his property. More than one person turned to look. He watched their faces, the way amusement curled into judgment. He had seen this before in deposition rooms, in back halls of court buildings. The moment a whisper campaign found purchase. The next morning, 2 new documents appeared in his mailbox. One was a laminated flyer from the HOA about noise ordinances and the importance of controlling loud animals in shared spaces. The second was anonymous, cut-out letters glued onto printer paper like a ransom note. It read, "If the dog is a threat, it's your fault. Fix it." Elijah didn't flinch. He filed both. The line had been drawn. The biscuit from yesterday sat frozen in a carefully labeled bag in his kitchen freezer, now transferred to a sterile container. At precisely 8:15 a.m., he drove it to a private veterinary toxicology lab 3 towns over, a contact he had worked with years ago during a suspected animal cruelty case. They didn't ask many questions. He paid extra for rush processing and promised to follow up in 48 hours. He drove back slowly, mentally replaying the details, examining every shadow and silence in his neighborhood's recent days. Ranger sat quietly in the back seat, head propped against the window, eyes watching the road without moving. He was calm, steady, as always, but Elijah knew that this kind of stillness had layers. Ranger had been a warrior, a tracker, a survivor. But lately, there had been hesitation in his steps, subtle fatigue, the kind you almost don't notice until it's too late. When they got home, Elijah went straight to the backyard. Ranger wandered to the shade near the fence and lay down heavily. Elijah opened the side gate, inspected the soil line, and found 2 new impressions near the bushes, slight but fresh. Someone had stepped just over the threshold and placed something again. He took a photo, logged the position, and placed a motion sensor under the soil in case they returned. He had just finished recording his notes when he heard it, a soft retching sound behind him. Ranger stood near the porch, head low, drool thick, and unnatural dripping from his jowls. Elijah dropped the tablet and ran. Ranger. The dog swayed, then collapsed onto his side. Elijah knelt down fast, his hands already on the dog's ribs, feeling the irregular thudding of a panicked heart. Ranger's breath came in shallow bursts, each one raspier than the last. His eyes were glassy but aware, trying to stay focused on Elijah's face. "Stay with me, boy. You hear me? You stay with me." Elijah wrapped his arms around Ranger's massive body, lifted with a groan, and staggered toward the truck, fumbling for his keys with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Traffic blurred. Stoplights turned red and were ignored. Horns blared in protest, but Elijah didn't care. Every mile stretched out like a challenge, every second another punch to the gut. He called the veterinary hospital ahead, shouting into the receiver, "Emergency, incoming, possible poisoning, he's crashing." By the time he arrived, techs were already waiting. He burst through the door with Ranger in his arms, his jaw locked, eyes wild, voice low but sharp. "He's been poisoned. Fast acting. I think it's internal bleeding." They rushed Ranger into the back, while Elijah stood rooted, fists clenched at his sides. The receptionist offered him forms, but he didn't take them. He just stared at the swinging doors where they had disappeared. Minutes felt like hours. When the vet came out, a younger woman with tired eyes and steady hands, Elijah's heart dropped at her expression. "He's in critical condition. Massive internal hemorrhaging. It's consistent with rodenticide ingestion, anticoagulant type. We've started fluids, vitamin K, oxygen," but her voice softened. "It depends how much and how long ago." Elijah didn't blink. "Save him, please." She nodded once and disappeared again. Elijah paced the lobby, the walls closing in, the air too clean, too cold. His thoughts spiraled. How had it escalated so fast? He had been careful, methodical. He had seen this type of hate before, slow, insidious, hidden under manners and committee meetings. But he had miscalculated. He hadn't expected her to act this quickly, or this ruthlessly. An hour later, the vet returned with no clipboard, no mask of professionalism, just quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "He was strong, but the poison was stronger." Elijah nodded once, like he was acknowledging a distant voice through water. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. He didn't suffer long. He was fighting until the end. Elijah whispered, "He always did." He stepped into the back room and stood over the table where Ranger now lay still. The dog's body looked almost peaceful, but Elijah saw the story behind the stillness. The betrayal, the ambush, the quiet cruelty. He reached out, brushing the fur behind Ranger's ear, tracing the old scar from their first case together. His fingers curled in tight. "I should have seen it," he murmured. "I should have known this was coming." Ranger didn't respond. The silence was final now. Elijah drove home slower than before. The sun had begun to fall behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the perfect white fences of Willowgate. He parked in the driveway and sat still for a long time, staring at the porch, the yard, the stretch of fence where it had all begun. Denise's porch light blinked on. She stood there with her wine glass, perfectly composed. She didn't wave, didn't smile. But she was watching. Elijah stepped out of the truck and walked to the front steps. He turned to face her, eyes hollow but burning. She turned and went inside. Elijah whispered to no one, "It's done." But what he meant was, "It's starting." Elijah didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't even speak once he got home. He walked into his study, sat down at the desk where Ranger used to nap beside him, and opened his laptop. The light from the screen lit his face in angles that carved him into something colder, sharper than before. He clicked through folders, logs, images, screenshots, and dragged them into a new directory he named WGL Case, Ranger. He opened the home surveillance system next, scrolling through the last 3 days of footage. As expected, the red laser flickered across the side yard lens during the same 1-minute interval every morning. Nothing definitive. Nothing that would hold up in court. Not yet. But the angles from his own cameras weren't the only ones that mattered. He had mapped the street, noted which homes faced which direction, and knew exactly who had the right perspective. The Vasquez family, 3 houses down, had a front-facing ring cam. Elijah had seen the infrared light reflected in their windows before. He sent Luis Vasquez a polite text, "Apologies for the ask. Would you be willing to share your front camera footage from 3 to 4 a.m. yesterday morning?" Hoping it caught something important. Luis replied within 5 minutes. "Sending now. Just downloaded. Hope it helps." Elijah opened the file and leaned in. The timestamp read 3:13 a.m. The frame showed the quiet street, empty for a moment. Then a figure appeared from the left edge. Hooded, gloved, slim build. White bathrobe brushing at their knees, a small bag in one hand. They paused beside Elijah's side fence, leaned over just briefly, and dropped something through the slats. The figure didn't linger, didn't look around. Their movement was efficient, rehearsed. As they turned back and walked away, a gust of wind caught the hem of their robe, lifting it just enough for the light to catch their face. Partially, not fully, but enough. Elijah froze the frame, zoomed in, and adjusted contrast. He knew that profile. The angle of the jaw, the distinct curl of hair escaping the side of the hood, the way they held their wrist like it was always sore. Denise Halvorsen. He sat back for a moment, breathing slow. The footage wasn't perfectly clear, but it was close. Close enough to push. Close enough to build. He packaged the frame and added it to the case file. Then he reached out to Maya again. Got her on camera. Sending now. Need your guy. Her reply was instant. Julius is in. You know the drill. He'll do it right. Elijah bundled the footage and added an export from his network scanner. He had pulled the surrounding Wi-Fi traffic from the last 14 days, something most homeowners never thought twice about. But Elijah wasn't most homeowners, and Denise had connected multiple times to her guest network on odd hours. More importantly, her router logs, open thanks to an unsecured access point, showed detailed browsing records for every connected device. When Julius arrived an hour later, he brought a sleek black laptop, a portable signal analyzer, and no small amount of quiet concern. They didn't speak much. Elijah simply handed him the logs, the footage, and a USB containing the recovered browsing metadata. She's good, Elijah said, but not careful enough. Julius nodded. Let's see how sloppy desperation gets her. 3 hours later, they had it. Julius sat back, cracked his knuckles, and turned the screen toward Elijah. She searched for rat poison 5 times, including the phrase, fastest fatal dose for large dog. She also Googled, how to deny responsibility if caught poisoning an animal, and this one's my favorite, can attorney general override neighborhood disputes? Elijah raised an eyebrow. She looked me up. Julius smirked. She knows who you are, which means what she did after knowing matters even more. Elijah stared at the screen, then leaned forward, typing a brief summary and saving everything in both cloud and local drives. The case was airtight now. The treat had been delivered by hand. The dog had died from the exact poison she researched. The timestamp matched the camera footage, and she had premeditated the cover-up. Elijah stood slowly. His eyes scanned the bookshelf above him, landing on the framed certificate signed by the governor for distinguished service in the field of justice. Ranger's badge sat next to it. He picked it up and closed his hand around the medal. She's not getting away with this, he said quietly. Julius just nodded. When do we take it public? Elijah looked toward the window, where Denise's porch light now flickered in the early dusk. Not yet, he replied. First, we go through official channels. No mistakes. She buried this in silence. We'll dig it up in daylight. The morning after Denise's first contact with the sheriff's office was eerily normal, as though the universe had not yet caught up to the shift in balance. Willowgate remained as pristine and manufactured as ever, lawns clipped with mathematical precision, flags waving as if pre-programmed, and neighbors moving in slow choreography. But Elijah was already working behind the curtain. He had spent the night assembling the last of the documentation, formatting it into a clean, legal-ready package. Instead of calling media outlets or posting online, he took a quieter, more devastating route. He submitted everything to a specialized task force embedded within the state's Department of Criminal Justice, the Environmental and Animal Cruelty Investigations Division. These were people he had worked with before, men and women who understood the nuances of intent, escalation, and how hate often wore a homeowner's smile. The report included time-stamped photos, digital forensics, toxicology confirmations, witness testimony, router log access, and camera footage. It read not like a complaint, but like a closing argument. That same morning, Denise posted to her Instagram a filtered image of her patio table set for 2, fresh-cut roses in a vase, sunlight bouncing off porcelain. The post might have faded into the stream of suburban social media had it not been for the growing undercurrent of digital scrutiny. Because even before Elijah went public, whispers had started circulating. A friend of a friend from the vet's office had shared what they saw: a man carrying a dying dog in his arms, face carved from stone, eyes filled with fire. A local journalist, digging into recent HOA conflicts for an unrelated story, had stumbled across the increase in calls linked to Denise's property. And now, with one ill-timed caption, Denise had unknowingly poked the internet's open eye. By midday, someone posted a screenshot of her caption alongside a local crime alert about an ongoing investigation into a suspected animal poisoning. The post gained traction, shared quietly among pet owner groups and anti-racism pages. Elijah hadn't planned to go viral, but by that evening, screenshots of Denise's old HOA forum comments resurfaced, coded language about outsiders, unpredictable pets, and preserving the character of the neighborhood. Netizens began connecting the dots. Her search history, though not public yet, became a topic of speculation. And with speculation came scrutiny. The digital world had taken notice, and once that current started, it didn't stop. But Elijah stayed quiet. He had no need to argue online when the law was already on the move. Within 48 hours, an official inquiry was opened under State Statute Section 3.2-6570. Aggravated cruelty to animals. The Sheriff's Department, now in full cooperation with the Attorney General's office, requested access to Denise's devices. A warrant was signed before sunset. Officers returned to her house, this time not with questions, but with instructions. Her laptop, phone, and even her smart home assistant were confiscated. Elijah watched from his living room window. Curtains parted just enough to witness the moment she realized things had spiraled. Denise stood in the doorway in a matching pink cardigan and slippers, arms folded across her chest, attempting to bargain in hushed tones. But the officers were clinical, unaffected. This wasn't about neighborly complaints anymore. It was a felony case. Elijah didn't celebrate. Instead, he contacted Sharon, his late partner's sister, an ethics officer who had always told him, "Don't just win clean." He forwarded the full case archive, asking for a second pair of eyes before the prosecution moved forward. She called an hour later, voice firm. "It's airtight. If she gets a decent lawyer, they'll try to plead out. But with this digital trail, she's cornered." Elijah closed his eyes, nodded, and finally let out a breath he'd been holding for days. Still, Denise didn't back down. The next day, she appeared at the monthly HOA meeting, smiling stiffly, dressed impeccably, acting as though nothing had happened. She made a motion about installing community speed bumps to keep pets safe, twisting the narrative like a pro. But neighbors were no longer nodding. Some looked away, others whispered. A few simply stared, arms crossed, silent. The trust she had once manipulated so easily was fracturing. Then came the leak. A local journalist received an anonymous tip, an internal copy of the digital evidence Elijah had submitted. While names were redacted, the timestamps, search history, and footage descriptions made it clear who was involved. The article dropped under the headline, "Silence Can Kill: Inside the Quiet War of Willowgate." It didn't name Elijah directly, but it described a retired law enforcement official losing his dog to a poison treat, and the systemic history of one neighbor's coded harassment. Within hours, the HOA board received over 50 emails demanding Denise's suspension. Two of the neighbors who had once backed her now issued public statements withdrawing support. And in the comment section beneath the article, the most repeated phrase became a kind of digital verdict. She knew what she was doing. Elijah watched it unfold from his desk, not with satisfaction, but with control. He hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't posted a word. He had only built the case. And now, the weight of truth was speaking for itself. Ranger's photo sat framed beside the monitor, his eyes forever alert. Elijah touched the frame gently, whispering, "They're starting to see you." The morning following the media leak brought a storm of consequence, cloaked in sunlight. Elijah stepped outside in his pressed charcoal shirt and dark jeans, calm and precise as ever, but this time with intent. Ranger's absence was still a weight in the air, but now that grief had taken the shape of purpose. Two news vans had parked near the cul-de-sac entrance, their logos discreet but unmistakable. and a young reporter with a tight ponytail and a too-eager smile approached him as he clipped his mailbox shut. "Mr. Grant?" "Elijah Grant," she asked, voice cautious. Elijah didn't flinch. "That's me," he said. The microphone lifted like a blade. "Would you be willing to confirm your role in the investigation?" Elijah nodded once, slowly. "I served as chief of homicide for the state's Department of Criminal Justice for 13 years. I recently retired. I moved to Willowgate for peace. Instead, my partner, my dog, was murdered." The words landed like stones. The cameras rolled. He continued, "I have filed a formal criminal complaint backed by digital forensics, toxicology, and surveillance. The person responsible will face charges, and she will be named in court." The footage aired that evening during the 6 o'clock local news, and it broke the illusion of comfort that had wrapped Willowgate like a curtain. For weeks, neighbors had whispered, avoided eye contact, pretended the tension wasn't real. But now they were forced to confront the weight of it. Elijah's name wasn't just that of a polite new neighbor. They now saw him as he truly was, a man who had once dismantled criminal empires with paper trails and patience, who now held the full force of justice behind his calm demeanor. The next morning, the sheriff's department returned to Denise's home, this time armed with a search warrant issued under probable cause for felony animal cruelty and obstruction. The neighbors watched as 2 unmarked cruisers pulled up and plainclothes officers approached the porch where Denise, dressed in her usual pastel set, stood with her arms folded, trying to smile as if they were delivering a package. They weren't. The warrant was served. She tried to object, claimed defamation, but no one listened. One officer moved through the house with a steady handheld camera, documenting everything as another opened drawers and cabinets in the kitchen. In the pantry, behind a row of ceramic jars labeled sugar and oats, they found a plastic storage bin filled with homemade dog treats, bone-shaped, peanut-scented, still warm enough to hold scent. Next to it, a half-used bottle of anticoagulant rodent poison, unlabeled but matching the compound listed in Ranger's tox screen. More damning still, in the drawer beneath the kitchen desk was a notepad. Elijah's name appeared on it multiple times in small handwritten columns. 7:10 a.m. Leash front sidewalk, 3:45 p.m. Turns right at Wexley, weekends, longer walks. She had tracked him, documented him, planned. The officers confiscated everything and left the front door closed but unlocked. Denise stayed inside, blinds now drawn, and for the first time in weeks, her porch light didn't come on. The rest of the street buzzed, not with noise, but with awareness. They knew. Some had suspected. But now there was no more room for doubt. Elijah remained composed. He didn't gloat. He didn't make a statement. He let the process speak. The vet's report had already been submitted into evidence. The poison, the placement, the pattern, all aligned like a noose drawing tight. Still, Denise wasn't done. That evening, a statement appeared on a local community Facebook group under her name. "I am being targeted by someone with influence. My privacy has been violated. These are rumors and assumptions. I would never harm an animal." The comments section quickly turned. Screenshots of her Instagram post resurfaced. Anonymous HOA complaints were posted, matching handwriting samples from the notepad. A few former board members, quiet until now, began to speak. One shared an old email. Denise always pushed for stricter screening of new buyers. Said certain types don't fit the neighborhood's image. The facade was cracking. Later that night, Elijah sat on his porch, sipping dark tea in silence, watching the houses around him begin to shift in their quiet recognition. Sharon sat beside him. "You didn't have to speak," she said, "but I'm glad you did. People needed to know who you are." Elijah glanced at the empty spot by his feet where Ranger used to sit. "They didn't need to know who I am," he said. "They needed to see what she is." The officer who read her rights had no hesitation, no warmth. This wasn't a neighborly misunderstanding or a noise complaint. It was felony-level animal cruelty with enhancements for premeditated harm and evidence of personal bias. Elijah watched from his front window, arms crossed, body perfectly still. He didn't record it. He didn't smile. He only watched as the woman who had once stood with wine glass in hand and passive-aggressive remarks on her lips was led away with her head lowered, eyes wide and darting, searching for sympathy and finding none. By noon, the booking photo hit the local news. Her name, age, address, and 3 felony charges listed plainly beneath the headline. Willowgate woman arrested for dog poisoning. Former state investigator cited as victim. The article was short, factual, unsparing. It didn't include Elijah's quotes. It didn't need them. The footage, the screenshots, the forensics, they all spoke louder than outrage ever could. Sharon read the article aloud while Elijah sat in the study, updating his case log. "She'll probably post bail," she said. Elijah nodded. "Good. I want her walking back into that neighborhood with the weight of the truth on her shoulders." The court date was set 2 weeks later. Elijah didn't announce he would attend. He simply arrived early, dressed in the same black suit he wore at Rangers Memorial. He entered the courtroom with a slow, even stride and took a seat in the first row, behind the prosecutor's table. His presence was not performative, it was a statement. That justice mattered. That silence was over. Denise entered through the opposite door, flanked by her attorney, a thin, balding man who looked exhausted already. She wore a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her hair pinned too tight, as if control could be mimicked by force. She didn't look toward Elijah. She looked past him, beyond him, like she still believed this would all vanish if she simply denied it long enough. The prosecutor opened clean. No drama, no flourish, just a concise layout of facts. Video footage of the suspect approaching the property at 3:13 a.m., timestamps of poison delivery, Google search history recovered from her home Wi-Fi router, phrases like fastest way to kill a large dog and how to hide dog poison from detection, detailed logs of the victim's daily routine written in her own hand. As each piece of evidence was presented, the courtroom grew quieter. The air thickened. Then came the vet statement, read aloud from sworn affidavit. Patient presented with rapid onset internal bleeding, consistent with ingestion of anticoagulant poison. Death occurred within 2 hours of symptom onset. Efforts to reverse effects unsuccessful. Pain level significant. Elijah stared forward, unmoving. Denise fidgeted for the first time. Her knee bounced beneath the table. Her hands clenched the edge of her seat. The defense didn't argue innocence, not directly. They attempted to cast doubt on the source of the poison, suggested the possibility of neighborhood mischief, even floated the theory that another animal may have dropped the treat. But then came the nail. Julius Raymond, called as expert witness, walked the jury through the search history Denise had compiled over 6 days. In clean, unshaken tone, he listed the queries she made in order. How to poison a dog without getting caught. Can dogs detect poison in food? Are security cameras legal evidence? Attorney General pet death, public cases. How to delete router history. With each line, Denise's body seemed to fold further into itself. The illusion collapsed. When the prosecution rested, the room was silent. The judge, a middle-aged black woman with courtroom gravity in her posture, called for a recess. Elijah remained seated while the crowd filed out. He stared at the defendant's chair, then lowered his gaze to the floor, eyes burning not with hate, but with the memory of loyalty, of the weight of Ranger's head resting in his lap, of that final, gasping breath. Later, as proceedings resumed, the judge addressed the court. Bias, particularly when masked in civility, is no shield against accountability. This court recognizes the severity not just of the act, but of its intent. And intent has been made abundantly clear. Denise still said nothing. Her attorney whispered rapidly, but she shook her head. Pride and fear tangled behind her eyes. The day after court recessed, Willowgate began to reshape itself. Not physically, its hedges still trimmed, its curbs still painted, its porch lights still twinkling in the soft amber of evening. But underneath the surface, something fundamental had cracked. For years, Denise had operated behind the veil of decorum, leveraging tradition, policy, and pleasantries as a weapon. But now that veil was torn, and the neighborhood had to choose which side of that rupture it stood on. It started subtly, first with the Rodriguez family, who had moved away the year before, quietly reaching out to local reporters to describe the anonymous complaints they had endured. Grass length violations, unregistered guests, noise reports submitted after family barbecues. Then came a letter from a teenager named Jamal, whose only crime had been riding his bike through the neighborhood one summer. Denise had called non-emergency services on him 3 times in a month. His family never returned after that summer. These stories weren't new, but they had never been heard out loud. Now they flooded in. Within 48 hours, the Willowgate HOA inbox received over 70 emails, not from outside agitators, but from within the neighborhood itself. A petition circulated digitally, calling for Denise's immediate and permanent removal from all HOA-related positions, citing abuse of authority, harassment, and behavior unbecoming of a community representative. By the end of the week, over half the neighborhood had signed it. Even those who hadn't spoken to Elijah directly now acknowledged him with nods that carried apology, guilt, or in some cases, respect. The woman 2 houses down, who had once posted in the neighborhood chat about suspicious dogs, left a bouquet of dark blue asters, Ranger's favorite color, on Elijah's porch. She didn't knock. She didn't leave a note. But the gesture said enough. Meanwhile, Denise's house stood like a forgotten theater. Curtains drawn, mailbox uncollected, porch light off even at dusk. No cars visited. No packages arrived. The silence that once empowered her now surrounded her like a punishment. And the final blow came during the next HOA meeting, held not in the usual quiet conference room, but at the community center to accommodate the crowd. The room was filled past capacity, residents standing along the back wall, others peeking through the glass windows outside. Elijah hadn't planned to attend. He wasn't interested in petty suburban politics. But then came the official invitation, hand-delivered by the interim HOA chair, a woman named Eileen, who'd served on the board quietly for years. She looked him in the eyes and said, "They need to hear you." "We all do." So Elijah came. He didn't dress like an official. He didn't prepare a speech. He simply stood when the floor was offered to him, walked to the center of the room, and waited until the murmurs quieted. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "My dog Ranger was poisoned," he began simply. "He was more than a pet. He was my partner. He protected children, stood beside victims, tracked missing people. He trusted people, even when he shouldn't have. That trust cost him his life." The room was silent. "I'm not here to ask for revenge," Elijah continued. "I'm here to remind you that silence doesn't mean innocence. And politeness isn't justice. Denise didn't operate alone. She operated with the comfort of your tolerance, your nods, your quiet. And maybe you didn't know where it would end. But now you do." Several heads lowered. A few faces turned red. Elijah looked out across the room, not accusing, but unflinching. Justice isn't just a court process. It's accountability. It's your willingness to act when wrong is disguised as routine. If you believe in this neighborhood, then rebuild it. Don't bury this. Face it. He sat down without applause. There wasn't any. But something shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't cheer, but lingers. The next morning, the HOA issued a formal removal order against Denise Halvorsen, permanently barring her from serving on any neighborhood committee and suspending her community access privileges pending trial. Elijah read the notice once and filed it quietly into a folder marked "Closure in Progress." But the story had already gone further than the cul-de-sac. Clips of his speech were shared online, racking up hundreds of thousands of views. The phrase "politeness isn't justice" became a tagline on social threads and comment boards. Not out of vengeance, but resonance. It spoke to something many understood, but few had ever heard out loud. Later that week, a local school reached out, asking Elijah to speak at a youth leadership forum. "Not about the case," the coordinator said, "but about what you said about standing when it's hard." Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked at Ranger's photo on his shelf, the one with both of them smiling after their final field op together. Then he nodded. "All right, I'll speak." The sentencing came on a gray morning wrapped in rain, not the heavy, punishing kind, but a steady drizzle that made the world feel muted, appropriate, Elijah thought, for a conclusion not made of triumph, but of reckoning. The courtroom wasn't full, but those who mattered were there. Sharon sat beside Elijah, her hand resting gently on his arm, and the interim HOA chair, Eileen, was a few rows behind, arms crossed, eyes steady. Denise entered in a plain suit, hair pulled back, her face pale and drawn. She no longer resembled the woman who once weaponized politeness from her porch. Now, she was simply another defendant awaiting judgment. When the judge read the sentence, her voice was level and final. For the felony charge of aggravated animal cruelty with demonstrable intent, this court sentences the defendant, Denise Halvorsen, to 4 years in state custody, with no eligibility for parole before 2 years served. Furthermore, the defendant is prohibited from holding any leadership, advisory, or voting role in a residential governance structure for 10 years, and is to complete a mandatory rehabilitation program focused on racial bias and ethical responsibility. Denise did not cry. She did not object. She stared ahead as if already leaving herself behind. Elijah didn't look at her. He didn't need to. Justice, when done right, doesn't demand eye contact. It demands consequence. And consequence had arrived. The court dismissed and people slowly filed out. No cheers, no handshakes. Just the quiet shuffle of a truth accepted. Outside, the rain continued. Elijah stepped into it without an umbrella, letting the water cling to his jacket, drip from his collar. Sharon walked beside him, saying nothing until they reached his truck. "You all right?" she asked softly. Elijah took a long breath. "No," he said, "but I will be." Instead of going home, Elijah drove to the cemetery on the outskirts of town. The roads were empty, and the trees leaned overhead like sentinels keeping watch. He parked near the rear gate, walked the familiar path beneath the tall pines, and knelt where the grass hadn't yet fully grown in. The headstone was simple, black slate with silver engraving. Ranger loyal until the end 2016-2025. Elijah placed his hand on the cool surface and whispered, "You did everything right." His voice cracked only slightly. "You stayed loyal. You stayed brave. You didn't deserve what happened, but I promise you, they knew who you were by the end." He sat for a while, letting the silence settle around him. Not an empty silence, but a full one, the kind that holds weight. A breeze moved through the trees above, and somewhere nearby, a dog barked once. Not in pain, just in life. Elijah smiled faintly. As he stood to leave, footsteps padded up behind him. A small boy, 8, maybe 9 years old, stood holding a paper umbrella and a confused frown. "Hey, mister," the boy said, glancing at the stone. "Was that your dog?" Elijah nodded. "He was my partner." The boy hesitated, then added, "My mom said he was a hero. She said he saved people." Elijah looked down, the ache in his chest twisting again, but softer now. "He did," he said. "Every day." The boy shifted his feet. "Are you the guy who made sure they caught the bad lady?" Elijah tilted his head. "I didn't catch her," he replied. "I just told the truth. It did the rest." The boy nodded, then smiled, wide and unburdened, and ran back toward the gravel path where his mother waited, waving gently toward Elijah before guiding her son away. Elijah watched them go, heart heavy but firm. The world didn't shift in grand gestures. It shifted in quiet moments, in truths repeated, in names remembered. When he returned home, he poured a small glass of scotch, not for celebration, but for tradition, and stood by the window where Ranger used to perch beside him. Outside, the neighborhood was still. The porch across the street was dark, curtainless, vacant. A realtor sign now stood in the yard, its colors faded slightly by rain. A week later, the HOA ratified new bylaws about leadership accountability and mandatory inclusivity audits. Elijah didn't attend that vote. He didn't need to. The point had already been made. And when the news finally faded, when social threads moved on and headlines quieted, Elijah remained, not as a symbol, but as a man who had lost something irreplaceable and refused to let it be ignored. He had loved a dog, and in losing him, he had reminded a neighborhood what decency was supposed to mean. The end. If this story moved you, Consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Let us know in the comments what part hit you the hardest. And where in the world are you watching from? Your thoughts matter, and your voice keeps these stories alive.